One of the first things I want to talk about is how to lay your pattern piece for your Santa hat out on your fabric. This fabric has not been quilted yet, but I thought it would be easier to demonstrate it on the cut piece rather than the quilted piece. If you notice on the pattern, there's two different ways to cut out the Santa hat. One notes directional fabric and one notes non-directional fabric. So non-directional fabric just refers to a fabric like if the Santa hat goes this way or it goes this way, it doesn't matter because there's not necessarily a top or a bottom or a right or a left. So you don't have to worry as much about the orientation versus this is some leftovers from another hat sample that I'll share with you later. This fabric has obviously a definite orientation that has stripes. So when you cut your hat piece out from a fabric like this with the stripe, you need to decide, do you want your hat stripes to go this way? Do you want them to go this way? Do you want them to go that way? So it's important to note the direction of your fabric. The reason there's two different sizes noted on the pattern for directional versus non-directional fabric is when you're working with directional fabric, my personal opinion is the best way to lay out the pattern piece is this way. You do end up with some extra pieces, but I have a little quilted stocking pattern, a little freebie that I'll share with you guys that you can do with your extra pieces. And you're already quilting the fabric. I don't think it's that much of a waste to do just a little bit more, especially if you have something to do with it. And I think that when you have your finished hat, I just think it makes more sense to know where your center front is. I just think it helps you to visualize it better. However, if you are working with non-directional fabric such as this, you can rotate your pattern piece and put it up in the corner. This corner is not like a perfect 90-degree angle, so you will still have to cut, but you get the idea. You can fit that hat right there, and that uses quite a bit less fabric. So in this case, instead of an 18 by 24 inch piece, I could cut an 18 by 18 inch piece of fabric. And I don't need those extra 6 inches. So that's why there are two different cutting sizes noted on the diagram, depending if you're working with directional or non-directional fabric. I'm going to make my quilt sandwich. And if you're wondering what a quilt sandwich is, quilt sandwich, here's another, just use my sample from earlier. Quilt sandwich is just referred to the layers of quilting fabric and batting that you use to quilt. So it's called a sandwich because your bread pieces are your fabric and the meat of the sandwich would be the batting. So I'm going to, with this piece of fabric, I'm going to make a quilt sandwich with my background fabric, my quilt batting, and my front fabric or top, like quilt top fabric here. And I'm going to have the wrong sides of the fabric facing the batting. Then I'm going to take it to my machine and I'm going to quilt it. You can quilt it in any method that you like. There might be something on the pattern to help you quilt it. As you can see with this, I just followed some of the stripes in the pattern. Another one, this particular hat, I quilted perpendicular to the pieced stripes in the fabric. You can also just quilt a grid. If you like to free motion quilt on your machine, you can free motion quilt. Or if you're new to this, I honestly think the easiest thing to do is just to quilt lines 1 inch apart across the hat. Now, one thing to note, if you do lay your hat out with non-directional fabric going this way, if I were to quilt this going up and down and up and down, then the quilt pattern, just to help you visualize it, if this were the piece and it's quilted this way, but the round part of my hat is coming this way, the quilting lines are going to run around the hat and they might not line up in the back of the hat the way you want them to. You can see with the hat made from this leftover stripe on the back of the hat, you have a nice pattern here that lines up. So if you do decide to place your pattern piece in the corner, one thing that you could do to kind of help your quilting lines be a little more intentional is instead of quilting 1 inch across, you could find your 45-degree mark which, you know, I'll find your 45-degree mark it, and then just quilt 45 at a 45-degree angle 1 inch apart across both sides. And that's actually what I'm going to do with this piece, just to kind of show you an option for it. Most of the hats are made with some sort of directional fabric or directional quilted print, so we will place the piece like this, and I will drop into the video some examples of how those are cut out. But for now, I'm going to make my quilt sandwich, go to my machine, quilt the quilting lines, and then cut this out and show you how to go about constructing your hat after that. I have created my quilt sandwich. I have quilted my pieces. This is for the example, just a reminder, if you're working with non-directional fabric and you can cut the pattern piece out from the corner. I'm going to drop a picture in of what it looks like to cut it out using directional fabric. There's also a picture in the pattern, but just to remind you. So I've got this quilted, and now I'm ready to lay out my pattern piece. What I'm going to do is I'm going to find the center front of the hat, and I am going to line up the center front with that center stitching line, just so everything looks kind of neat and tidy as it's cut out. I think it's a little bit easier, rather than pinning this, I think it's easier to use some chalk and trace it and then cut it out with scissors, but do whatever makes you feel comfortable. Just so you know, this is what it looks like on the back. I've quilted my lines 1 inch apart going one direction, but if you want to, you can also go the opposite direction, or you can free motion quilt it, totally up to you. But I just wanted to show you what I thought was a simple way to quilt it, especially if you're new. I'm going to cut this out and I'll proceed to show you the next steps of the pattern. This is cut out. This is extra scrap. I'm going to show you what to do next. I'm going to take the hat piece, and from here on out, the pattern process is the same whether or not which directional, non-directional fabric, everything's the same from here on out. All right, so you're just going to fold this in half this direction and pin it in place along this side. And if you're particular about things, you can come in and even match up your stitching lines if you stitch them a 1/4 inch apart. If you did the patchwork version, take a moment and line up your seams of the patchwork pieces on top of each other. It just looks a little nicer when the project's finished. All right, this is pinned, and we're gonna sew this with a 1/4 inch seam, but I'm gonna call it a generous 1/4 inch seam. It's not quite a 3/8 inch seam, but a full 1/4 inch seam is just gonna give you a little more grip, but 1/2 inch seam's a little bit too large. So just sew this along this edge. This is sewn, and now you have a raw edge here. It's up to you how you want to finish this. If you have a serger, you could just run a serge line. You could also do a wide zigzag stitch, or you could do a bound seam. I'll show you how to do the bound seam. Personally, I recommend a zigzag stitch because this bound seam will add a little bit of extra weight to the hat and might not make it as floppy, may not lie the way you want it to, but I know a lot of you guys really prefer a bound seam, so I'll show you how to do that. So I've got a piece of fabric cut from my lining fabric, and it's just longer than my seam. It's 1.5 inches wide, and I'll just pin it along the edge. This piece of fabric is not cut on the bias, it's just a straight strip of fabric. I'm just going to sew that strip of fabric to my hat in the same location on that same stitching line that I used to attach the hat to each other. And then I'll flip it over so it's right sides facing, fold under the edge and stitch it down. All right, this seam is sewn, so I'm going to flip it around to the other side, and I'm going to fold it so it comes close to that edge. Just kind of press it in place with my fingers, and then just going to make sure that gets really nice and tight in there. Push this in, and if you have binding clips, they're perfect for this. And just pin that in place and work all the way down. Obviously didn't get that pin in the right place. If you know which direction you're going to stitch, you could also put the pins this direction. I might go ahead and do that. I think that might get a little bit better result. All right, pin that all the way down, and then take it to your machine and stitch it in place. And it's the inside of the hat. It's not going to show too much. I like to stitch it on the folded side close to the edge of the fold so it catches all of the layers. All right, that is sewn. You can see the stitching line there. I trimmed off the extra fabric from each end, and then I cut the top of the hat at a 45-degree angle going the opposite direction just to reduce some bulk in that seam. The next thing we're going to talk about is the fur, and I'll share a few tips for you for cutting out the fur. All right, here we have a piece of faux fur from Joann's. It is flannel backed faux fur. It's white, so it's going to have a hard time, the camera's going to have a hard time capturing the detail on this, but I'll do my best. So part of the mess of this fur is from the fur, but then part of it is if you cut the individual fibers, it creates more of a mess. So I'm going to show you the best way I think to cut this. So we need a piece for the brim 5 inches wide, and I happen to have a 5-inch ruler. And I know this is not perfectly straight on this edge, but I'll go in and clean it up off camera. So what I like to do is I like to use a craft knife with a sharp blade, and the objective is to only cut through the first layer of fabric, not to actually cut the fur, because the cutting of the fur is going to make a much bigger mess than the cutting of the fabric. So just come in here, I've got a fresh blade on my craft knife, and you'll kind of get a feel for how much pressure you need to put on this. Oh. All right, so you can see I'm making a mess, but the mess is mitigated a little bit by only cutting that backing fabric. Also, this way you can see how big your piece actually is. It's hard to see on the fur how big something is. All right, so this is mostly cut. I'm going to finish cutting this, and I'll cut it to the length noted on the pattern. The small and the large have different sizes. And then I'm going to show you how to attach it to the front. As far as this kind of messy, I recommend, using your hand to get as much of it off as you can at this point. And then just use a little handheld vacuum and come and get the rest of it out of the way. But it's messy, but I really think it's worth it because it's just so cute on the finished hat. All right, my fur is cut, and just to show you, I just have a little handheld vacuum. Just ran it over the fur piece just to kind of help get those extra pieces off before I keep sewing it. It does a pretty good job. Then you don't have as much mess going forward sewing wise. The next thing you want to do is take your fur piece that's cut to length, put it right sides facing, and stitch it in place using a 1/2-inch seam allowance. You're just going to stitch this on your machine, just a regular stitch, same way you would sew any 1/2-inch seam allowance. All right, we're ready to finish constructing the hat. I'm going to take the hat piece and we're going to turn it right side out. At some point, you're going to want to use some sort of pointy tool. I'm using this turner. You can use a 3-point turner, hair tool, pencil, something, and really get this point at the top of the hat out as far as you can. All right, The other thing you want to do is take this seam, this to your iron, and press this seam as flat as you can get. You don't want to press this because we don't want like an angle on the hat, but you want to make it so the hat doesn't have a tendency to want to collapse in along that seam. All right, so now we've got our hat right side out, and we're going to turn the fur right side out. But what we're going to do is we are going to pin the fur, the right side of the fur, to the lining of the hat. And when I pin, I like to start, I usually offset these two seams just a little bit so they kind of nest into each other. And you're going to put this inside here and pin all the way around. One thing to be careful of as you pin, make sure that you're not pulling on this so that this is tighter than this part. You're going to want to almost kind of give a little extra ease to the fur portion of the hat as you pin, because it will stretch and we do not want it to stretch out. I'm just going to pin this all the way around until I get back to the other side. That seam, these two pieces should fit into each other pretty close to perfect. If they don't, the reason we used a 1/2 inch seam allowance for this part of the fur brim was so that you can increase or decrease the seam if you need to. So if you're off by a lot, you can make a larger seam or you can also take that seam down to 1/4 inch if you need to. But if your measurements are correct and you stuck to your seam allowances, that should be pretty close. I'm going to finish pinning this. That is completely pinned, and I'm going to take it to my sewing machine and sew around the bottom edge with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. All right, for this portion of the project, I've removed the free arm of my sewing machine, and that will just allow the hat to kind of sit there a little nicer around the bottom of the machine. One thing to note, have the fur, polar fleece, minky, whatever you're using, facing the feed dogs. See, these are the feed dogs. These are what actually moves the fabric through the machine. They will help to evenly feed this fur as you sew around the outside. So we're going to find the seam here, get this on, and we are shooting for a 1/2 inch seam allowance. All right, this is sewn. Then we'll just have to finish the hat. So what you want to do, pull the fur out and then fold it up. And you're just going to fold it up so that the top of it, kind of these seams line up on top of each other. You don't need to finish this seam. The fur is just going to get to a point where it's not going to shed anymore. This isn't really going to fray. If you're really worried about it, you could run a zigzag stitch, but I wouldn't bind this. It's going to add too much bulk. Plus, we're going to cover it up. You're going to need some heavy-duty thread and a big needle. And all you need to do, you don't have to do it at every point, is we're just going to tie a few tacking stitches into this. You don't want to sew it because it's going to, it'll mess with the tension of the hat. You're just going to put a little stitch there, and you can see it's hidden there. I also probably wouldn't do a running stitch for that same reason, because I think that you may accidentally gather and kind of put too much tension on that. So you're just going to take that and run it all the way around, maybe 8 or so tack stitches just to hold that into place. All right, last thing we need to do is attach the pom-pom. I've linked the exact pom-poms that I bought. These ones came with a little hook. Not all of them will come with a hook, but it doesn't matter. So what we're going to do is we're also going to take that big needle with the heavy-duty thread, and we're going to come up through the point of the hat. You're going to do your best to get as close as you can to the center of that hat with that needle, and I like to put the needle on the cutting mat and push it through so I don't hurt my fingers. All right, so we've got that pulled through. So now you're just going to find a point in this ball that you can stick the needle through. You could use this hook, obviously, if you bought these, but if you didn't, I'll pretend like you didn't. So though, I'm just going to take this and I'm just going to go straight through that pom-pom there. Pull on that needle, and then I'm going to come back. You don't have to go into the hat, but we do need to come back through the hat again to tighten it up, and then tighten that, and then do 2 or 3 more stitches there just to get it in place, and then tie a knot, cut it, and usually I like to put my needle back in to hide my thread through the center of the hat. And that's it. You're probably going to want maybe a lint roller to get some of this extra fur off your hat, but you are ready to make your hat. Thanks so much for sewing along with me again, and follow along. There will be lots of fun new projects coming next year too.